Hello, my name is Amanda Barnes, and today I will be sharing my case study, which centers around St. Lucia, a small island in the Caribbean, and its economic vulnerability to climate change. As previously mentioned, St. Lucia is located in the Eastern Caribbean in the Windward Island chain. It's north of Martinique and it's south of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It has a population of approximately 170,000 people and a land area of 620 kilometers. In 2012, St. Lucia was cited as the world's top 40 climate hotspots to watch. As such, it's not surprising that it's extremely vulnerable to natural disasters, including floods, hurricanes, landslides, droughts, all of which impact its economic stability and impact the individual livelihoods of its citizens. Now, to exemplify this point, the 2005-2006 Trade Adjustment and Poverty Report submitted to the Caribbean Development Bank stated that with the onset of an adverse economic shock, so for example a natural disaster, approximately 40% of the population would be susceptible to poverty. Now this is 40% of the population in addition to the 28% that is already experiencing poverty, totaling almost 70% of the population, exemplifying why this is such a huge challenge and problem for the country of St. Lucia. St. Lucia is prone to a number of natural hazards, including hurricanes, floods, and landslides. For instance, St. Lucia experiences hurricanes every 3 to 4 years. And since the last hurricane was in 2010, it's expected that a hurricane could occur this summer. Generally, the hurricane season is from July to November. Hurricane Thomas resulted in $336.2 million in damages, approximately 34% of St. Lucia's GDP. Hurricane Thomas was devastating, and it took the economy a while to recover. St. Lucia is also prone to floods. Floods are caused by storm surge and coastal wave action. The frequency of floods is increased due to the island's poor drainage systems, and approximately 60% of the population is at risk for flooding, since 60% of the population lives in the low coastal regions, which are prone to floods. Landslides are also common, due to the mountainous terrain. Unfortunately, landslides tend to disproportionately affect the poor, who build their houses on steep slopes with poorly engineered materials. St. Lucia also experiences coastal erosion or drought. So, coastal erosion is the result of natural occurrences such as wind, waves, tides, or currents, as well as human activities like sand removal or inappropriate construction on the shoreline. Now, coastal erosion is a concern for St. Lucians not only for their own individual property loss, but also because it highly impacts tourism. So, for example, with 100 meters of erosion, 30% of tourism would be impacted, and 53% of turtle nesting sites would be lost. Now, the reason I highlight turtle nesting sites is because it's actually one of the things that brings people to the island, because tourists would like to watch this occurrence happening. So similarly, with 1 meter of sea level rise, 7% of tourism, 6% of turtle nesting sites, 50% of airports, and 100% of seaports would be impacted, again affecting tourism and causing a point of concern for St. Lucians. Now looking at drought. Drought occurs during the dry season, which is from December to April, and can result in chronic water shortages. Now, dry season can also be known as high season because that's when tourism is most common. You'll see Canadian or American tourists that are trying to escape the dreary cold and heading to places like St. Lucia that are a little bit warmer. This can be problematic because that means that there's an influx of people coming to the island, putting pressure on their natural resources, particularly their water accessibility. At times like these, some rural regions actually have limited to no water access, which is very concerning considering that most of the people living in these regions are reliant on agriculture, which obviously requires access to water. So this is just a quick slide. It's demonstrating how natural hazards have impacted St. Lucia. In short, hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, landslides, coastal erosion, drought, they all impact the economy and stability of St. Lucia, particularly with tourism and agriculture, tourism being the main driving force of the country. Water accessibility, for example, is impacted by droughts, just as food security would be impacted by droughts as well. With infrastructure, we saw with the example of Hurricane Thomas how expensive a natural disaster can be for the country, and a lot of this expense is from the loss or the damage of infrastructure. Individual livelihoods are greatly impacted with the loss of jobs. If they're living off the land and the ecosystem is damaged, that also can have some very adverse effects. So pretty self-explanatory, but it's nice to just have kind of a summary slide. St. Lucia relies heavily on its natural resources. Thus, it is extremely vulnerable to natural disasters. The majority of St. Lucia's economy is centered around tourism, and to a lesser extent, agriculture. Now, according to Thornburg, the government spends the majority of its funds on tourist-oriented infrastructure. Now, that's problematic because that means that there's less money to go around, resulting in an underfunded social security system. By depleting the social protection programs, this leaves St. Lucians even more vulnerable to the onset of a natural disaster. Historically, St. Lucia's economy has relied on its banana exports to Great Britain under the Loam Convention, a 1975 preferential agreement. However, in 1996, the World Trade Organization had a ruling which led to the destruction of the Loam Convention and increased international trade competition, which resulted in the decline of banana exports. This caused St. Lucia to rebrand itself as a tourist economy. As I highlighted earlier, tourism is a primary pillar of St. Lucia's economy. This point is demonstrated with the example from the World Bank, which states that approximately 62% of the country's GDP is derived from the service sector, of which tourism is a part of. Now, as we all know, disasters can impact tourism. It can create infrastructural losses as well as reputational losses. What's problematic with reputational losses is that they actually span over a longer period of time, which is often past the recovery period, threatening the stability of the tourist economy. Now, what's interesting to look at is who owns tourism. And from my research, I actually found that foreigners own tourism in St. Lucia. Now, Thornburg highlights that tourism is seasonal, characterized by low wages, with virtually no benefits and protection for workers. So essentially, it's not helping the individuals living in St. Lucia. Now, as I mentioned, the industry is under foreign control. Foreigners operate the airlines, cruise ships, they own most of the hotels and resorts, and they own or control tour operations and food imports. The monies that has been gained from tourism has actually often left the island and has been spent abroad. And because St. Lucia has such a poorly developed tax system, the government's not really gaining all the revenues that it could from these resort properties, which is limiting the funding for social service programs. So I want to take a second to look at political policies. So when I say political policies, what I'm really looking at is, what is the government doing? Now, I'm going to start this conversation by looking at land use zoning plans. When I say this, generally I'm looking at how is the government regulating the location, type, and intensity of new development. So this can often include flood zone regulations, which in St. Lucia are often not actually enforced. So for example, there's no prohibition of reconstruction of storm damaged property in high risk areas. There's also no strategic retreat of the existing or new developments in the coastal regions. Now, if we look at hazard maps, St. Lucia has done some hazard mapping in the past, but it was in the past. Most of the maps are actually out of date now. Most of them were done in the 1990s, so they're not as effective as they could be. Moving on to building codes. Building codes in St. Lucia are very rarely enforced. There's no incentives for individuals to use stronger or more resistant or sturdy materials in their building. And this is actually quite problematic because often for those in the lower income brackets, they'll use sand in place of concrete, and they'll cut corners in a lot of their building construction, making them more vulnerable to natural disasters. Now, if I look at it says at the bottom, Coastal Engineering Training Project, and how that was successful. So if I talk a little bit, I just want to talk a little bit about that. Essentially, this training was on how to build physical structures or barriers to negate things like coastal erosion. So while this project was successful, one of the criticisms is that physical barriers are actually quite costly and you have to repair them. And sometimes it can be better to use natural barriers, such as planting more mangrove trees, for example. Also, if I look at the poverty tax, and I apologize for jumping all over the place here, but if you look at poverty reduction and the property taxes, one of my main criticisms for St. Lucia is that the government, especially with tourism, the property tax system hasn't been developed to its it hasn't been developed to a greater capacity, I guess, or it needs to be improved, essentially. We have quite a number of very high-end resorts, which, relative to the amount of money that they're gaining from tourism, is not being reflected in the taxes that they have to pay for that land. And money, if it went to the government, could be redistributed to things like social programs. Also, when we talk about property tax, another thing to think about is that with a better property tax system, the government actually might have some more influence on the building, creating incentives on where to build, as well as deterrence for places that might not be as safe. And just to finish off, looking at insurance for my research is generally not used on the island. It's just too expensive. So that was something else to kind of highlight in terms of policies. So I'd like to take a second to talk about poverty and environmental degradation. So the research shows that poverty is positively correlated to environmental degradation in St. Lucia. For example, a rural farmer might engage in poor farming practices such as over-harvesting as a means to gain short-term income or funds. Now, why this is problematic is often over-harvesting will cause soil erosion or soil depletion, which in the long run affects the farmer's stability. Similarly, other disempowered St. Lucians have been noticed to overfish in order to provide for their families and themselves. This actually results in a loss of marine habitat. So in essence, the resources that these people are most dependent on are the ones that they're aggressively depleting. And the research demonstrates that their reliance on these resources makes the poor particularly vulnerable to natural disasters. So according to poverty statistics, approximately 28.8% of the population in St. Lucia was poor in 2006. Now, poverty is defined by falling below the poverty line, which is measured by the minimum spent per adult in order to meet the basic food and non-food needs. So this was estimated to be 13.993 Eastern Caribbean dollars, or $5.22 US, daily. Or, to put it in other terms, 423.83 Eastern Caribbean dollars, or $158.74 US each month. Now, as you can see, poverty rates are concentrated in the rural districts. This isn't surprising if you think about the increase in natural disasters, combined with the loan convention, and the price fluctuations of the global market, and how this has impacted the country's agricultural output, often causing a decrease in output, which affects rural incomes. With this in mind, it makes sense that there's a concentration of individuals living in poverty in the rural districts. So I want to take a second to focus on the second module, which speaks to the idea of food security. In St. Lucia, rural areas are uniquely vulnerable to climate change, mainly because a lot of the people living in these regions work in the agricultural sector. Now, with the increase of periods of droughts or extended rainfalls, there's higher likelihood of soil erosion, which can lead to crop failures, and thus affect individual livelihoods. Contributing to this problem is unsustainable agricultural practices, including overharvesting, or the repurposing of agricultural land. So, for instance, taking really fertile soil and then building a house on top of it, which is particularly problematic in St. Lucia, considering that there isn't that much fertile soil on the land. Now, without the training in agricultural diversification, the farmer's capacity to adapt to climate change is greatly inhibited. And Caribisave, I don't know if I said that right, has suggested that bringing in new agricultural technology will actually greatly enhance the area's food security. Similarly, Thornburg suggested that improving the market accessibility will reduce food imports in favor of supporting more local goods, which can assist in food security and help reduce poverty. So in conclusion, as a resource-based economy, St. Lucia is extremely vulnerable to natural disasters. Disaster risk reduction policies have been created to mitigate this risk, however, they cannot be successful if there is no political will or funding to enforce them. Deforestation, overfishing, sand mining, and pollution are all activities that relate to poverty and further contribute to individual vulnerabilities. Rural farmers in particular are at risk due to their reliance on their land and their increased exposure to poverty. Thank you for listening to my presentation.